So something like that.
I'm going to do
It's not too I mean, I looked at the homework and stuff, but I didn't like, I wasn't obligated to. It was nice. I was taking it privately.
Okay. It's going to be perfect. Yeah, sure. Lucas, you're taking notes, right?
Yeah.
You better.
How long do I have to like upload them?
What?
How long do I have to upload them?
Whenever people are uploading, I guess. Okay, so you see how serious I take teaching. I should be here. I'm sorry. I should be here nicely in Berkeley, listening to Stuart telling me how to stop the robots from killing me, because there's a nice workshop on safe AI that's being held. Instead of doing that, I'm teaching here. But I mean, I'll be there late night today and then for the rest of it. And then I'll come back and tell you at least partial story of how you can save yourself from the robot Armageddon. Okay. Okay. The other thing is that actually today has been like particularly crazy, even by my standards. So I had to prepare sort of for this workshop and giving some kind of a talk here. There was a PI meeting that was going on in the morning, and then some Washington Post reporter called up and talked for an hour about how to explain stable diffusion and DALI for random people. So they're going to write one more article on that. So it's like I needed all this stuff while I was making this class slides, for which I had in abstract, I had an amazing lecture, like amazing. It was like working very well in abstract. You'll figure out whether it works in concrete or not. By the way, that's also an interesting point about abstract versus concrete thing that you'll see in a minute. But so today I am going to be talking about abstraction and what is this? So abstraction, hierarchy, and knowledge-based planning, and least commitment. So the problem basically is everybody loves abstraction. Lucas apparently particularly so. But the problem is it sort of, there just typically tend to be all sorts of issues that get pushed under the rug. And so when you start thinking seriously, what should abstractions be doing? and how they should be working, things fall apart. Okay, and so to some extent, in a weird way, today would be the class where I would show you my MS thesis and my PhD thesis, both of which are connected to abstraction. But I haven't done too much about abstraction of late because I got a little disillusion. Because there are ways. I mean, I think it's time to get back to them, but I think I oftentimes think when I see somebody say, "Oh, we're doing this abstraction," and yeah, you are not really. You are kind of missing a whole bunch of things, and you push a whole bunch of things under the. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let's just start at a high level. Basically, abstraction and is hierarchy are important to make planning tractable when you have very long range planning. Depending on what you consider as your actions, for example, walking, putting step in front of each other could be action, or deciding to give a particular instruction to the torque, the motor, to put a particular torque in the joint of my leg is also an action. So you can see what lowest level of primitive actions can you think about. And if you actually think in terms of those, oftentimes you will have major trouble figuring out. Anyway, major trouble figuring out how to actually put together long enough plans, because you get stuck in the details and you forget the bigger picture. So everybody loves the idea of looking at the bigger picture. But the problem with the bigger picture is that everything is working well in the bigger picture, but it's not working in the concrete level, because you are essentially deluded yourself that, yeah, the things are like this lecture today. It's in my head, it's completely working. But as I'm talking, it would become clear as to whether or not there are disconnects between slides, for example. Right? So that's things that become important. And how do you decide what is the right level of abstraction? How do you decide when there is an abstraction of the problem? Do you use the abstraction by itself and then go down to the concrete level, or do you just directly go and use both the abstractions and the concrete level operators at the same time? If you understand what I'm saying, it'll become clear again. So one interesting question we'll see in strips planning is one type of abstraction for strips planning is what I call macro operators. We'll talk about in a minute, which essentially correspond to chunks of operators cemented together. If you're doing Lego block building, instead of just normal blocks, there could be like some big structures that you're chunked up together. And those are like the macro structures. And you can put the whole macro structure somewhere, for example, right? That reduces the amount of, so you're making big steps, for example, in such a case. So the question then is, when you have that sort of macro operators, and you can think about it in the back of your head, do I then just try to construct the thing and using only the macro operators, and then I'm done? Or do I have to consider the macro operators along with normal operators? In which case, in essence, I've increased the branching factor of the search space. Right? Before, if there are A actions, the system has to look for which of the A actions should I do in this action, in this state. Now, if I start having macro operators, there can be exponentially more macro operators. You see what I'm saying? And so if you just use the right macro operator, it's great. Why? So the interesting question you have to ask yourself is, why do we have Swiss Army knives when instead of having a very tool specific, very application specific tool? You're always impressed when you go to somebody's, workshop, they have the right tool for everything. Swiss Army knife is not the right tool for anything. It is an okay 5th level tool for many, many things. You understand what I'm saying? So the question in abstractions would be, that's actually a particularly interesting trade-off. Do you just think at the abstract level, or do you actually look at the abstractions as well as the concrete part of the problem at the same time? And if you do one versus the other, what do you lose or what do you gain? These are things you may not have thought about when you thought about abstractions in general. And so hopefully I'll kind of get you to understand that. So anyway, so long plans cannot be made unless you have abstraction. It's very clear. Big structures, prefab homes exist, right? Instead of just building it brick by brick by brick, then they just have prefab homes that they just put on the trucks and bring it and throw it in your backyard and you have a home now. So that's a faster thing, for example. Okay, so what are you losing when you do that? You don't get Taj Mahals when you depend on the prefab homes. They all look like cookie cutter homes because they are cookie cutter homes. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so if you wanted, I have the prefab home, but the following nice, modifications to it, at some point of time, with all the modifications, the prefab home is basically useless for you. And you have to think about this when you think about abstractions in general. It's a very seductive concept. I think we do need abstractions, but at the same time, how to make sure that when there are abstractions, actually is there any reason to believe that our overall performance improves, which is what we are looking for. And if it doesn't, then what are you giving them? And so many ideas that you have talked about in this class and in Intro to AI are all connected to these notions of abstraction. In particular, the very notion of heuristic is abstraction. Where did heuristics come from? Heuristics come from abstract models of the problem. So that means the problem was abstracted by somebody. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so heuristics themselves come from the abstraction. The interesting thing about heuristics is you'll notice that you don't just, so think about the following thing. The straight line distance heuristic is a heuristic for making my way in this class. Agreed? Right? So that's an abstract level. So I can actually try to figure out how to get there by acting as if I can walk, and that's my plan. And then I try to make it more specific. Then that would be solving in abstract and then solving it in concrete. But you don't do that when you use heuristics. Why? Because it actually doesn't work as well. Because the straight line plan, the actual concrete plan might be arbitrarily far from the straight line plan. Because this abstraction is not a good abstraction, really. It's like, it's a very generalized abstraction. It's a very strong abstraction. And so, in fact, there may not be any plan to get to the corner that involves straight line. I have to make major detours around the straight line. And if I'm making major detours around the straight line, if you think about the paths as plans, my abstract plan is this. My concrete plan is going around like this, going around like this, and going there, because there are all these obstacles in the middle. Would you see the concrete plan to be just the concrete version of the abstract plan? It's very, very far away. In general, the way we use heuristics is basically we make the heuristic drive the underlying problem solver. So that means whatever level at which you are solving the problem with abstracts, etc., you still are doing search in that level. The heuristic is only basically trying to tell you which direction is more interesting right now. Keep that in mind, because that idea of abstraction is different from what you think of as abstraction. Typically, the most obvious thing that people think of when they think of abstraction is I make the plan abstract and then I concretize it. Right? And it works in many cases. So for example, I have this abstract plan of taking the flight at 8:15 tonight and then going to San Francisco, taking like an Uber to Berkeley and then reaching hopefully not too late after midnight. That's my abstract plan. Okay. And then, concrete versions depend on actually, like, for example, maybe there is no Uber available. Maybe I do something slightly different, or maybe I'll, there are certain details I completely ignored. But also, if there is actually, once I go there, if the American decides to be late today, then I have to deal with a very different concrete version of the plan. At the same time, it was useful for me to have an abstract plan because it's much faster. Is what I'm saying. So it's useful to think of abstraction as heuristics. And because you will get certain insights that you won't get otherwise about what an abstraction does. Okay. Again, I mean, I kind of like this. Given that your life is strictly speaking not episodic, you're really making one long 3 gazillion action plan for your entire life. Everything is connected to everything. Right? And so if you want optimality for life, then you're making this one plan, and then basically there's like no way to actually do that. And then that's exactly when this really famous quote that I love as a planning guy from John Lennon comes, that life is what happens when you're busy making plans. If you're really making optimal plans for your entire life, then you're not living. Right? Because there's only so much time. The time for planning as well as time for living is all together, you have about 100 years. Okay, so there is this question of how to make the planning faster so that then you can somehow give up on these optimality constraints, etc. As I said, there are many, many ideas across planning and also MDPs and reinforcement learning. And in fact, some of these ideas are reinvented across the 2 fields in very different names. But understanding from one side and then making connections to the other side allows you to get a lot more interesting insights. So for example, we'll see very soon that macro operators, basically chunk operators, in graph search can be seen as skip connections. You see what I'm saying? I mean, those of you who know resonate or something, the skip connections now. From this state, you used to go to this state, this state, this state, this state. Now there's like a skip connection. Okay, so now if I'm thinking of graph search, macro operators are skip connections. If I'm thinking of Markov-Dacian processes, what would macro operators look like? It turns out they look like what are called options, which are essentially mini MDPs, which have their own entry states and exit states and a mini policy encapsulated inside. Okay, now you make that connection between macro operators and options, suddenly lots and lots of things fall into place. If you look at them as completely different ideas, then that's RL, this is planning, this is not connected. Okay, so we'll see that. Again, as I said in the beginning itself, all the ideas are sound and great upfront, but on closer examination tend to suffer from all kinds of problems. And then within STRIPS planning, that we will be focusing on today more, and then we'll slowly get to RL next class. Although I will be making connections today too. The focus has been more on using abstractions if abstractions are given, as against learning them. First, upfront, trying to use the abstraction correctly if it's given to you. Secondly, acquiring abstractions. And I use the word acquiring rather than the word that you guys know and love, which is learning. Okay, acquiring could be somebody just gave it to you. In particular, in planning, abstract knowledge was given by the domain writer who gave the PDL. You understand what I'm saying? Since they're giving you PDL knowledge, why can't you give me some abstractions also? So they would give that. Now you could learn it too, but more often, they were focusing on acquiring. And so because of which in planning, there's an entire area called knowledge-based planning, which is essentially, you would say, what do you mean knowledge-based planning? As if the other planning is not knowledge-based. Well, the idea was, if you only gave domain physics, that means just the state transition function and nothing more, that was considered just the minimal knowledge. That's like the 0th order. Anything more you're giving on top of that is considered additional knowledge. That's called knowledge-based planning. And many of the ideas about abstraction, including the very famous one that everybody would have heard of, not probably not in this class, but people outside of planning would have certainly heard of one idea from planning, which is hierarchical task network planning, which is like somehow the summit of all these ideas together. It does have all the advantages of all the other ideas we'll talk about. Not surprisingly, all the disadvantages of all the ideas we talk about. You see what I'm saying? It's like an umbrella idea. Okay. But that basically, hierarchical task network planning, originally, the way it is used in planning even today is the HTL task reduction schemas that we'll talk about are given by the people, by humans, the domain writers. They're not learned. And so if there's anything wrong, the planner can basically just say, hey, you screwed up. You gave me the wrong knowledge. So it's not my mistake. Okay, so that's why the knowledge-based planning part becomes connected. And then the third thing was in the very beginning, surprisingly enough, if you remember, STRIPS was the original planner also, which used the STRIPS knowledge as STRIPS type operators. The very next paper was Abstration, which is abstract strips. And then the third paper, if I remember correctly, either the third paper or maybe the 1.5 paper is the macro operators. And then the fourth paper is HTL plan. That was NOVA. NOVA by Sacerdote, who wrote basically, who was the second author on the STRIPS paper, the first author on the Abstration paper, and again the first author on the HTL planning, because the NOVA is essentially an HTL planning thing. Of course, those days people would give procedural rather than declarative semantics for anything. So he would actually call the task reduction schemas as soup code. I'm not making it up. It's called soup code. So the idea would be there has been action, you give it to the soup code, it will then expand it to a bigger plan. You understand what I'm saying? And in fact, there's a whole entire history there. NOVA went from mean sense analysis, state-based planning to least commitment, hierarchical task network planning in one fell swoop. That's it. And then the next 30 years, people were breaking their heads trying to make sense of why is this working out. You see what I'm saying? So NOVA actually is both the partial order planner that we talked about and the hierarchical task network planner that I'm about to talk about. He came up with ideas like promotion, demotion, etc. In particular, actually, funnily enough, if there is a conflict in a causal link, it would only consider promotion, not demotion. Why? Because it worked. In his example, promotion worked. I didn't know that demotion is needed. You see what I'm saying? So then somebody else later on can write another paper saying, look, NOVA can't solve this other paper, particular problem. Actually, it was hard to say that because NOVA's code was never available. This was the great days of vaporware, where essentially you don't have any GitHub kind of nonsense. So you say, you ask me, I'll tell you whether my planner will solve this problem. Okay. So anyway, so NOVA was actually HTL planning as well as least commitment planning together, and and understanding that actually will happen part of in today's class. Okay, so desirable properties of abstractions. I'm actually still trying to see why I can't. Oh, this one. Okay, maybe. So desirable properties of abstractions involve soundness, which is kind of a soundness, which is if you have an abstract plan, can it be made concrete? Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay, so it's like a binary version of the continuous problem that I was mentioning earlier. I had an abstract plan of going straight to the corner. Okay, and suppose actually there are walls in this entire room and I abstracted them away. And my actions don't allow me to break walls. So yes, there is a straight line plan, but I can't actually find a way to execute. There's no concrete version of it that I can do. Do you see what I'm saying? So there would be a case where the length of the abstract plan is 5 units, the length of the concrete plan is infinite number of units. Right? Whereas the previous one, length of the abstract plan is 5 units, the very binding concrete plan was 25 units.
So that abstract plan be soundness?
So my question is, again, the soundness is in terms, typically people talk about soundness in terms of is it even feasible? That means, is there even a plan? If there is an abstract plan, is there even a concrete plan in planning community? In RL community, there is no such thing. Because RL, everything is just optimality. Infeasible is just a little more in optimal. See what I'm saying? I mean, we in search and planning, we try to differentiate between planning, the feasibility and optimality. In RL, typically you just talk in terms of, just optimality alone. And so there is basically, there's no difference between soundness and completeness. They just think in terms of completeness and optimality. Okay, so if you have an abstract plan, can it be made concrete? Actually, if this property exists, especially in the context of feasibility, you would call such an abstraction with downward refinement property. Most of you, when you think about abstractions, think of abstractions that have downward refinement property. You understand what I'm saying? When they work, the reason I made this plan to go to San Francisco, which involves just, I'll just take the flight and I'll take the Uber and then I'll get to my hotel, is because, I'm pretty sure there would be some feasible version of the plan that does all those things. You understand what I'm saying? That does all those things, but it might do lots and lots of digressions in the middle, but it kind of does all those things. Okay, so that's downward refinement property, and it's very hard to get. Actually, most useful abstractions do not have downward refinement property. Think of any abstraction you can think of in life that you're like, oh, I like this, this is a good way to abstract. Like, for example, I can take the flight and go to San Francisco. Yeah, good luck to you if in fact Hurricane Ian is hitting that. There are no flights. You see what I'm saying? Okay. So then the other version of this that you may not have thought about, that's kind of very interesting, is one is if you have a plan in the abstract level, is there a plan in the concrete level? That's a downward refinement problem. The other is if you have a plan at the concrete level, is there a plan in the abstract level? This is like, it works in theory, does it work in practice? It works in practice, does it work in theory? Equivalent, right? Okay, so interestingly, that's called upward refinement property, and some abstractions don't have upward refinement property. Essentially, there may be solutions that work at the concrete level, but there is no footprint of them in the abstract search space. What that then means is even if you do, so here is the interesting thing. If you have a downward refinement property, then as soon as you get a single correct abstract plan, you can stop doing search in abstract level and just concretize it. Because some way of concretizing it will work. Got it? Okay, so DRP allows you to stop as soon as you find an abstract plan and work on concretizing it. Yes.
Do you have to consider the nuance between planning and scheduling when you do downward refinement?
Actually, for now, just think in terms of planning and boxword planning. I will talk a little about scheduling later. Okay. And then URP, on the other hand, basically, why is URP useful? The reason URP is useful is it's one thing if the first feasible abstract plan cannot be made into a concrete plan. It's another thing altogether if no feasible abstract plan can ever be made into a single concrete plan. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you have URP at least, then you can do this funny backtracking. Make a plan on abstract level, see if it can be concretized. If not, go back, make another plan on abstract level, see if it can be concretized. If not, make one more plan, see if it can be concretized. Would this be better than just doing search in the bottom level? No, no way. It's a dumb idea. But at least you get to say, I got abstraction going. You see what I'm cynical about abstraction, as you can see. Right? So upward refinement property is, it's like if you don't even have that, then you are essentially doing an abstract cooking plan and are hoping that a concretization of that will get you to San Francisco. Think of it that way. Right? Because there is no footprint of any concretes correct San Francisco reaching plan that even exists in the abstract space. If so, then finding one more abstract plan is not good. Normally, most abstractions you have are at least, if they are reasonable at all, they will at least be URP, upward refinement property. If they are DRP, in essence, the problem is easy. You understand what I'm saying? It must have been the case. So it's the same thing. Imagine if I can tell you that there is a problem for which perfect heuristic can be computed in a polynomial time, then you know that that damn problem is polynomial time. If you can, otherwise you could have computed in polynomial time. Perfect. Okay. So that's the thing to remember. These are very important properties, URP and DRP. Once in a while people talk about it, most of the time people don't talk about it. Okay. The other thing is completeness. Is the abstraction complete or optimal? Again, as I said, this is a strange distinction I'm making, feasibility versus optimality. In planning, in strips planning, we distinguish between feasibility and optimality. In RL, in general, they don't. They just basically say, RL thinks infeasibility is just really enough. You see what I'm saying? Okay. So we can also talk about whether completeness exists with the same thing. You had a question.
Yeah, I was asking regarding soundness. Do we need both something to be DRP and URP for it to be sound, or only DRP?
If you, no, I mean, I think I actually, this is not a definition. That's why I put a tilde. These are soundness oriented ideas, and this other one is completeness oriented idea. And I already told you that they're all connected, basically. They're all basically in RL community. Is there such a thing as an unsound policy? Why is it? Think about this, Karthik, right? You can say LLMs don't know how to plan, but man, they know how to do policies. Because any policy is a policy. It's just pretty down enough. You understand what I'm saying? It's very useful to understand this, because if you think only in terms of the cost of the policy, the quality of the policy, then it's like between 0 and infinity. I mean, the minus infinity in terms of quality. And then you could have a very, bad policies can just have minus infinity as a quality. Okay. So coming to the completeness, is the abstraction complete or optimal? Can you find all the plans you could find before without abstraction? So the thing is, the whole point of abstraction is you have a model of the world. You're trying to infer plans with respect to that model of the world. You just want to do it fast. Right? So you want to do the reasoning, first in abstract level, then maybe in concrete. So the worry is, if there are solutions that you can do in concrete level that are more optimal than the ones you can do by abstraction, then you lose the optimality property. You guys understand what I just said? Okay, imagine the following thing. What is the shortest path between here, shortest path? Don't care about time at all, just the shortest path between here and Flagstaff. I only care about the centimeters, even if I'm going up the hills and coming down the hills. It's just the number of centimeters I have traveled. Okay, I'm not talking about crow flying, that's abstraction. Shortest path in terms of actually following the landscape manifold from here to Flagstaff center town. Okay, consider the length of that plan. Nobody follows that. Most people take highways. The length of the highway plan and the shortest plan, how are they comparing? Oftentimes, the highway plan can never be smaller, right? Okay, so I would argue that by taking the highway, you lost optimality with respect to my constraint. which is a very reasonable constraint, which is the length of the plan. Agreed? How do I make sense of this now? Now I no longer am optimal. I'm using stuff which is not optimal. Remember, in abstractions as heuristics view, we worried about this. What did we do in that case? We considered admissibility of the heuristics. It's not just abstraction. The heuristic cost estimate has to be admissible. In which case, using the heuristic won't give you a plan that is any longer than the optimal plan that you would have found in the base space. Except when you're using heuristics, there is no such thing as base space and abstract space. The abstract space thinking is guiding the base space planner. But typically, when you think of abstraction, you think there's an abstract planner and then it gives a plan, then you can calculate it. And if you do that, you are guaranteed typically to lose optimality. Right? So then, in what sense is somebody going to be able to say, hey, you took a roundabout way to go to Flagstaff when you took I-70? And how are you going to say, no, I didn't take a roundabout? I mean, you actually know that you took a roundabout way, right? Because you actually went, if you only cared about the length, not the time, not the cost of travel, etc., just the length, there is a cheaper plan, by definition, to go to Flagstaff than taking I-70. So how do you then convince your friend that, no, it's not bad. I'm still optimal. What do you say?
Change the constraints.
What?
Change the constraints.
No, you say, yeah, one more idea. Any other ideas? How do you tell your friend that you're still optimal, even though you're taking I-70?
Another abstraction of time.
No, because I decide what my constraint is, what my quality metric is, and you have to tell me if my quality metric is your abstraction working or not.
Whether you can actually check the plan or not.
Well, that can be. I mean, I'm actually saying that it is actually feasible. I mean, it's not that hard to think. Hey, look, before I-70, the other Indians, were going to Flagstaff. I can assure you that this is happening. How the heck did they do? They did say, hey, let's just wait. I'm sure I-70 will come out. Those guys were taking the shorter paths. How are you any better than them? What will you say? You'll say, yeah, who cares about optimality? We are highway optimal. You see what I'm saying? You change the metric. You say, yeah, I'm not optimal, but I'm highway optimal. Nobody laughs at it if I say I'm hierarchically optimal, which is what most abstraction literature in RL claims. They're hierarchically optimal. That means given the hierarchy, this is the best I could have done. Which is a very different moving goalpost than what would you have done if I didn't give you the abstraction. Do you understand what I'm saying? So in fact, the way people deal with the fact that optimality is lost is to come up with new optimality notions, which have no actual basis in anything. Right? Because highway optimal depends on how many highways are there. It has nothing to do with the word. It is the highways were added on top of the word. Okay, and then there is one more idea. By the way, actually, I'll make you guys I'll send you a gradient pub paper that I was looking at. I forgot to mention it to you. You should read this after this class. That gradient pub paper basically is hierarchy and abstraction reinforcement learning. Unlike the stuff that I'm talking about, that seems to have old stuff from 1984, etc. This stuff is brand new. The question is anything improved in terms of understanding? I'm hoping that after hearing this, you can actually look at that paper and see what parts actually are different and what parts are just ignoring the problems. Okay? And in fact, that's what we'll do for the next class. You guys will read that before the class. Okay, so abstraction, so you would basically say highway optimal. By the way, the MacGyver dog, which I showed you, the dog that I showed in the beginning, I call it MacGyver dog. You know, MacGyver basically would find strange random solutions. If your life involved, if your normal life involved finding MacGyver plans for everything, you would have been dead long back. You see what I'm saying? Okay, you most of the time do routine plans which are not necessarily optimal, like at all. You just stick to like the two known ways of coming here, even though there may be shortcuts, etc. I just ignore all of those. You will never consider heating your home by switching on the refrigerator. MacGyver would. Why? Because in your abstraction, refrigerator only has one effect: cool the food. You ignored all the other stuff that it basically puts a hole in the ozone layer. Okay, and that it increases the heat of the home. All of that, it's abstracted away. Well, if you abstract it away, you can't then use it to heat your home, or if in fact some aliens are kind of coming to get us and we need a hole in the ozone layer to get out of this place, we'll all switch on the the refrigerators and air conditioners. That's a great plan. We never used it for that purpose. You understand what I'm saying? MacGyver dogs don't use abstractions. The reason you're surprised at this dog is the dog is not doing the doggy things. It's feasible what it did, but this is not what dogs do. They mostly stick their tongue out, look this side, look that side, go to sleep. That's their abstraction of the world. And they perfected it, and that's been good for them. And then this dog basically said, hey, I do have feet, I do have things to pull. Let's just see, let's do full-on strip search and then find out what I can do. Okay? Think about this, that abstraction allows you to do the same thing more and more times much faster. And that doesn't mean that you're optimal. You're optimal not in the execution. You are optimal in coming up with an okay plan and maybe suboptimal in executing it. Yes.
So I'm not sure that I get the hierarchical optimality. Is that saying it's optimal given the abstractions we've made?
Yes. So actually, it'll become extremely clear once we get to HTM. And essentially, and I'll just say that if you would say that a plan given an HTM set of HTM schemas, a plan is hierarchically sound, if in fact that plan has a parse in terms of the HTM schemas. That means it's grammatically correct with respect to HTM schemas. And among just that set of plans, if you are the best, then you're hierarchically. In essence, that's what you will get. If you're doing complete search, but you're actually sticking to the hierarchy, then you'll only be hierarchically optimal. You can't be any more than that. Now, you might say, fine, you want optimality. So either you can do highway optimal, and in fact, there's this other idea called recursively optimal, which is just as silly an idea. These are all stuff that, RL, abstract and RL folks made up. It's like good, looks good, and you can prove theorems. But is there any point to it? Recursively optimal. But you can just say, well, I can also be optimal. How do I become optimal? Use the abstraction as a heuristic and make sure that the abstraction is actually admissible. Then it doesn't look at all like abstraction, but at least you get to guarantee that you are now also optimal and you're also complete. So this was the idea that if you just use macro operators to generate plans, you may not even be able to find some plans. And if those plans wind up being the optimal solutions for your problem, then you are missing them. So you can say, I am macro optimal. That means given what I get to use, I'm optimal with respect to this. And so in fact, I might also not be able to solve some problems because the macro operators are given. You understand what I'm saying? So imagine the following thing. Give me a problem that you cannot solve in terms of this Phoenix, Flagstaff, if you are doing highway optimality. Suppose you need to drive to, not drive, suppose you need to get to some point in the boondocks on the side of the highway somewhere. The old Indians have, sure, that's your goal, that's where I'll get there, before I die, but I'll get there. You, I say, shoot, you go forward, shoot, you go backward, you never reach the goal. Because the highway basically doesn't get off. It won't allow you to get off to this funny place. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if you want to provide optimality at that level, then you will say, I take highways as well as walk. Which means, then if I'm strictly taking that view, then a plan to go to Flagstaff would involve the following steps. Get out, take a hitchhike, look for a hitchhiking thing, and then go for 10 meters. Get down, walk for 15 meters. Get down, take a bus for 2 miles. Get down, try to get a plane or a passing helicopter for another 18 miles. Get down, blah, blah, blah. Is this a valid plan in the strict sense? Yes, it is. Would anybody in their right mind, other than those good old Indians, do it? No. You see what I'm saying? So some people basically say, oh, you can make hierarchical plans optimal by just throwing in all the original operators into the search space, which means you have macro operators as well as the normal operators. At that point, it's no longer clear that abstraction is a good idea, because macro operators increase the branching factor, reduce the depth. And the search is approximately B power D. So increase B, reduce D, effectively, it's not clear that B power D is going to be reduced. In fact, for the longest time, there were religious wars saying, are the macro operators right or wrong? And people who like our macro operators will say, I know exactly which one to use, and so I'm fine. And the systematic people will say, look, you don't know which one to use all the time. You have to consider all the possible operators because of which your branching factor increased. This is for macro operators. If you translate into reinforcement learning, it will be in terms of options. Is the problem going to go away? No. Can you ignore it? Yes. You can always ignore any problem, right? So it doesn't go away. So in fact, this problem about macro operators has been called the utility problem in learning. Just because you learned something doesn't mean it improves your performance. In general, that is true for any learning. It's particularly true in sequential decision-making and planning kinds of places where you get all these extra operators which just increase your branching factor, don't necessarily reduce your expected cost. You understand what I'm saying? And in fact, the word utility problem somehow got connected. You guys know Spanish flu, right? I mean, so many of you. You know where Spanish flu started? Probably in Kansas. Why is it called Spanish flu? Because that's where they found it. Why did they find it in Spain? Because during that time, it was First World War. Everybody else had news blockade. Spain was neutral. Spain was just happily saying what's happening in their country. And they said, oh, we're having this flu. Oh, Spain has Spanish flu. You understand what I'm saying? So the origin of the place where you find something suddenly becomes the name for that. And then you start thinking, well, Spaniards, are probably very flu-oriented. Right? Okay. So the same thing can happen in utility problems. Utility problem, things like macro operators, it turns out, are basically can be learned, quote unquote learned, but they are kind of the deductive closure of the original domain knowledge. In fact, you can prove that the macro operator is correct given the domain knowledge. Whereas in inductive learning, what you learn cannot be proved to be correct. It's a leap of faith. Since macro operators have this property and they happen to be deductive learning, as is, for example, explanation-based learning, which is another idea which is also deductive learning. People decided, oh, deductive learning has utility problem. No. Learning has utility problem, which is why we forget. Understand what I'm saying? We learn a whole bunch of stuff and we hopefully forget a whole bunch. Otherwise, our brain will be so full that, that will be like that far side kid who says, may I be excused, my brain is full. And then he needs to get out of the class. Forgetting is just as important as learning. And forgetting essentially is, I made all these macros, but some of these I'm not doing. That reduces the branching factor. And this has nothing to do with the deductive part of the learning. It's just learning in general as it is. Okay, fine. Then the other desirable property is stability. Are abstractions, problems, are the abstractions specific to the problem and the agent and the optimality metric? Are they general? You would like to believe that abstractions are general, but you know that they're actually very much specific to all these other details. For example, the very reason why highway optimality is not a good optimality is because I said my optimality metric is the amount of distance you traveled, not necessarily on car, not necessarily on flight or anything, just the amount of distance you had to travel to get there. So all of a sudden you optimized with respect to like highway distance, and I'm asking you for an optimality metric which involves just real distance. So the abstractions you made for the highway distance just don't work for when you change that. This makes then you your interest in abstractions kind of reduces a little because it looks like I have to make abstractions every time separately. In essence, actually, the idea is that abstractions have to be learned based on the problem distribution that you have. We'll see this. Okay, so that's the first two slides without actually giving any examples of what abstractions were used in planning. Now I'm going to look at some examples. Okay, the two things that you already talked about macro operators. I'll talk about macro operators again. I'll talk about something called precondition abstraction that AppStrips did. And then I'll get, those are the two prototypical ideas. And there are many, many variations of those. Then we'll get into HTMs in the second part. Okay. Okay, so there is abstraction, hierarchical planning, there are all sorts of things, detail abstraction. So basic idea is work on important things first. If you have goals, then work on the importance of goals first. And in planning, preconditions are sub-goals too. Preconditions of actions are sub-goals too. Do you understand what I'm saying? Okay, and so it is. So, for example, if basically people said, that if somebody told me that Rao, be at the workshop in San Francisco and make sure you have a pen. Right? Which one should I start planning first? The pen or workshop? Most of you will agree, yeah, first get yourself to the workshop, and if you don't have a pen, you can beg, borrow, steal. If you're not in the workshop, you can't get it. So after two goals, one is a much more important goal. Actually getting to San Francisco is a costlier process. Finding a plan for that and doing that is costlier process than just having a pen. In Block's world, having hand empty is an easy goal. If you ever need hand empty, just take whatever you have, drop it, hand empty. On AB, on the other hand, no, not really. You understand what I'm saying? So you can actually say some are details, some are more important sub-goals, and you work on the more important sub-goals first, and then get a skeletal plan and try to expand it to make the details work out. This is where the point about scheduling can come in. In fact, you can actually argue that when I ignored the pen sub-goal or the hand sub-goal, I'm assuming resources are plenty. And these parts can be ignored and I can figure that out later on. What if suddenly there was like a pen shortage in Berkeley? And in fact, unbeknownst to me, the whole reason Stuart called me for this workshop is because he knows I have a pen. And so he called me just for that. Then I go there and say, can I get you a pen? I say, I got you because of pen. And what's the use of having you without the pen? And the same thing for hand empty, right? If you actually, it turns out that making hand empty, they're not, for example, getting a hand to pick a block, the identity of the hand that picks a block, if you have multiple hands, it doesn't matter which hand picks the block, honestly. So you should be able to ignore that detail and schedule it later. So normally, actually, when you do planning and scheduling together, you tend to do scheduling after the planning is over. So you abstract scheduling, do the plan, and then schedule. In general, that works, but I can always come up with pathological examples where there is a scheduling problem because of which your plan won't work. And not only that, it should have been obvious to you because you have the domain model according to which you could have foreseen this problem. This is not, I don't know the word. It is, I know the word because I have the model. I just was lazy. I was trying to be doing things in the higher abstraction. Yes.
No, it's just about that your plan could technically change if you have scheduled problems.
Yeah, I mean, also sometimes the plan that you made may be infeasible because it can't be scheduled. So then you have to change it. And in fact, I'll show you an example of work that we have done, where basically we assume essentially something like your upward refinement property. So that means every schedulable plan also is a plan. It's just a bi-level abstraction. Plans are at the high level, scheduled plans are at the lower level. And I'll make a plan, I'll try to schedule it. If I can't schedule it, then I go make another plan and try to schedule it. As long as URP holds, this will work. Okay.
If you have a certain bias or preference for certain kind of actions taking place before other actions, would you put those in your abstractions, or would you treat it like some kind of policy that I want to get my pen before it like this?
No, those are constraints. If you want things to be done by the agent, those are already, everything we have said before still holds. I have a constraint. And that's a goal constraint. And it's up to you to make sure if you're using abstraction or not using abstraction, that's to make your life easy, not to make my life as the problem specifier easy. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so we'll talk about abstracts. We'll talk about essentially macro operators. In RL lingo, it's called temporal abstraction because you're making skip steps. And if you think each step is actually like a unit instant of time, then you are skipping over multiple units of time. Honestly, this is actually the poor man's or poor person's view of time. The real view of time would be metric. And the kind of thing that I was mentioning last time, we'll get to temporal planning, which is actually a lot more interesting. But when you use options, it basically RL folks will say, oh, we're no longer MDP. It's not Markov because an action is actually skipping over multiple steps. So it becomes semi-Markov. It's the kind of theory that makes people happy. Okay, which is interesting. It's a reasonable theory. But on the other hand, all the problems that you know of macro operators plus more will happen when you are getting options. Okay, not less. So the temporal abstract macros, options, reuse and replay are coming here. So in fact, there is this other thing called reuse and replay, which will become clearer. In the macro operators, one of the interesting things is you take a structure and use the whole structure or nothing at all. But imagine that I allow you to dismantle the structure, parts of the structure. Then suppose you bought a prefabricated home. It has one extra room you don't like. You just dismantle that part of it and you have a home that you're happy with. Right? But where do you stop? What if the entire prefabricated home makes you feel like vomiting? So you just essentially demolish the entire prefabricated home, get the bricks or the clay, make new bricks, make a new house. This is what I'm saying. Have you reused? Have you reused the plan? Have you reused the original structure? Do you understand what I'm saying? Again, the extremes are interesting because how far will you go in changing what you have? Like, I mean, there's this beautiful things, right? I mean, like in the good old days, people will go and say, give me a hamburger, and that's it. I mean, I would never say it at all because I eat hamburgers, but random stuff, people will say, go ahead. Or you go to a coffee place and say, give me a coffee. Now nobody says that. Just specifying the coffee will take 15 to 25 minutes. You know, give me a coffee in like the 15 millimeter size thing with foam, blah, 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 and then goat milk and something else. You must hold it by left hand and you should have a red top on it. And if you don't, I'll take a picture of your tweet saying Starbucks sucks because they don't satisfy my coffee cravings. And Starbucks is trying to get coffee done faster, cheaper than you actually making coffee by yourself every day. And unbeknownst to them as well as you, to make all of you unhappy, you are spending 15 minutes specifying how to make the coffee, because of which they're making another 25 minutes making the coffee. Instead of the good old days where they'll just open some black liquid and fill the cup and give you, and you're done. Is that the best coffee? Of course not. It's not the coffee that I like. But you want coffee, make it at home. Actually grow the coffee plants, make it at home. That would be the best way to make coffee. You understand what I'm saying? So if you do over customization, then essentially you're not any longer reusing anything. So there was a plan for making coffee. All these crazy analogies actually do have connection to the plan as much as they don't look like. So there is a plan for making the coffee, a default plan that all the quote unquote baristas are learning in the barista university, right? And the poor guys never get to use that. They're supposedly using it, except bozos like you will go and give a 15-minute specification of the, a coffee. And so are they reusing their plan or not? It's more like I dismantled the prefabricated home and rebuilt my home myself. And doing so made the barista very unhappy. Okay, so now the interesting thing is in this spectrum of use the macro as it is to change as you please. There are useful, reasonable places, and that would actually be captured by case-based planning or plan reuse. Okay, and one other very interesting problem about this is we'll see actually, and this becomes an important thing, that many of the ideas of abstraction were developed in the context of state-based planning techniques. Remember state-based planning techniques? Think in terms of contiguous plans. Right? I make an action, next action, nobody can come in between. But the very idea of abstraction makes you think in plan space. Imagine you did a state space strips plan at the highest level of importance and you made 5 actions. Those actions will only work because they only give the good preconditions, important preconditions. They don't care about the detailed preconditions such as the resources. To make them work, then between each of these actions, you have to put more actions. If during the search, you put more actions between 2 actions, you're no longer doing state space planning. You're actually doing plan space planning. And once you realize that it's plan space planning, you may as well just screw the state space planner and go to plan space planning. And then to your consternation or chagrin, you would realize that something like the precondition abstraction that I'll be talking about in the next slide is just a goal ordering heuristic for partial order planners. And it's not even a particularly good one. You see what I'm saying? Right? I mean, it becomes hard to be all excited once you know all the details. It's important, abstractions are important, but they are very problem distribution specific, etc. Not the way you typically tend to romanticize when you hear the word abstraction. Okay. Again, these big questions I already talked about. Where do abstractions? Actually, this one I'll talk a little bit more, but as I said, where do they come from? Learned versus given. How are they used? Lots of thorny issues. Can abstractions make planner too typecast? That was the MacIver talk. It does. Basically, abstractions will generate cookie cutter homes. One of the advantages I have about my home is if I'm walking in the night, I can still find my home. My home looks different from every other home on my street. My biggest nightmare is that I get transported to Avaduti or something, and then I'm walking in the street, and then the night I can't tell which house I'm supposed to be, and I go to the wrong house, and they say, hey, here they come. It's shooting at you. At least I don't have that problem because all our houses look different. Whereas the modern houses all look cookie cutter houses. They improved the process. Yeah, that's why they all look exactly the same. Okay. And then, of course, hierarchical task decomposition is this idea that combines all the things. So it has all the advantages plus more and all the disadvantages plus more. Okay, that's the way it is. So detail abstraction. First is the detail abstraction. So the idea would be focus on important parts and then work on the less important parts. Now, the question is, what are important parts? As I told you, if I have to be in San Francisco and have a pen, you would think, yeah, having a pen is less important than being in San Francisco. That is probabilistically generally true. But there are cases where I can construct where having a pen is harder than being in San Francisco. Okay, so the only way I can make sense of this abstraction is with respect to the types of worlds I live in, the types of problems I have to solve. Okay, in strips, basically you focus on achieving some preconditions before others. And that was the idea of ab strips, which was, like, as I said, the second paper of the strips. The ab in ab strips is abstraction strips. And this was the 1974 idea. 1974. Okay. So ab strips idea is given a ranking of preconditions, so basically all the goals are considered just the preconditions of the dummy end action. Effects are considered the, effects of the initial state is considered the effects of the dummy initial action. If you view that, then everything is just action with preconditions and effects. Then in trying to achieve goals, you first, basically all the conditions, goals will have numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And the 1 is the highest level of abstraction. You first try to make the plan work for those goals. Then 2, then 3, then 4. And what you do is you make the plan for the first level. It's the skeletal plan. You put more actions in between the actions to get the second level plan, and so on. In the case of strips, actually, it becomes an interesting, in the case of strips, it becomes an interesting recursion, right? Basically, I'm making plans like this at the abstract level 1. And in the next level of abstraction, basically, I have to go from this state. So basically, I just take this, expand this, and say I am here. And then from here, I need to go to this guy. Right now, this guy is only supporting. Right now, these actions, level 1 conditions are already supported. But level 2 conditions are not yet supported. So you kind of give a sub goal for your strip, say, given what is the initial state here, because remember, the initial state is completely specified. So even level 1 as well as level 2 conditions at this point. Given those, I want the level 2 conditions of this guy to be satisfied. That becomes a recursive strips problem. You solve that. And then similarly, this kind of gets expanded to, you solve that. And then basically in all of these places, there'll be more actions put. And then in the next level, there'll be even more actions between these actions. You guys get the point that I'm saying, right? This is ab strips. Yeah.
So I guess, what if we're wrong about like which actions are more important, or which goals are more important than others? And like, so say we get to like level 3 or something, and everything blows up. Because
that's what I'm saying. So you should start asking yourself: does this idea make any sense? Does it have DRP? Does it have URP? And then Ernst Hasselberg will say, those terms weren't invented, and I wrote this paper. Right? I made one particular example that works. And why are you complaining? And to some extent, interestingly, we are coming to that level again in AI. certain good examples are working. Why are you complaining about what are the guarantees as to exactly when this idea will work? So the AI went through neat and scruffy cycles. The scruffy is it works, so why complain? Neat is why the heck does it work? So scruffy, neat. We are in scruffy stage again. Okay, it's important. That's the way the science works. But it's worthwhile understanding that eventually, science involves understanding when something works, not just it works, why are you unhappy? I mean, bridges were built before we knew strength of materials. If we waited to understand strength of materials, we won't have bridges. But if we never understood why bridges work, then essentially some of the bridges will be falling off, some will be missing. I'll say, okay, then you'll have to make all these. Now, gods are unhappy with our bridges. Let's do extra pujas for the gods, instead of actually having a scientific theory as to why the bridge is actually standing versus not standing. So this is I owe you put yourself that I'll understand when bridge will stand. Right now, I'm happy enough that the first 15 cars did fall. So by inductive leap, I'll say 16th car will be fine too. And then, I just leave. That's where we are in, by the way, in the current. There are all sorts of interesting things. I mean, having a bridge that involves even one car not falling is a huge civilizational breakthrough. We had no idea how to build bridges. So when the first time the bridge was built, if some bozo was there saying, we don't know how the bridges work, let's not just use bridges, you should be saying, we won't get to the next level unless we actually use the bridge. But at the same time, we have to understand why it works. Okay. So anyway, that's in terms of abstracts, yes, it actually doesn't have DRP. It also doesn't have URP. And it will be interesting. You can actually, these are the kinds of things that you can prove for yourself. And it took about 10-15 years for people to pay attention to that. It's actually now undergraduate level understanding, but you should understand this thing is possible. So abstract idea is given a ranking to preconditions. First level just work on making all the highest level preconditions. Second level, the next highest, etc. By actually introducing more actions. Okay, how does this look in terms of the plan? In the original scripts, you wind up putting more actions in the middle of actions you have already included. You notice that. What that means is, for example, you might say hand empty precondition is detailed, so you basically try to expand it later. Right? You try to make it satisfied, at later time by putting an extra action that involves just put whatever you're holding down. Okay. One interesting thing is, so in a way, strips is no longer generating actions with contiguity constraints if it is abstracts, if it's using abstraction. It is doing some kind of a pseudo plan space planning. If you're doing pseudo anything, might as well do the whole thing. You understand what I'm saying? You're doing pseudo plan space planning, why not just do the plan space planning? So ask yourself, how would abstracts work if it was actually doing, how would abstracts work if it actually was doing, how will abstracts work if the planner is plan space? What happens in the high level preconditions? I will put the actions to support those high level preconditions, and it's causal link planning. So there is a P1 precondition, somebody is supporting P1, this guy has a Q1 precondition, this guy is supporting Q1, he also has a R1 precondition, this guy is supporting R1, this guy has a J1 precondition, the subscript imagine is the level of the condition, okay, and this guy is supporting J1. This is just a partial order plan with causal links. Not only that, you know what you are keeping. You actually remember your commitments. In fact, one of the problems as to why abstracts gets into loops is in trying to put additional actions here. So in trying to put additional actions here, it may well have essentially, suppose it, it basically put this action so that it will give J1 for this action. Those additional actions may have killed J1. And you're not going back because I did abstract, it should be fine. And so in the end, I'll say I'm done and it'll be unsound plan. If on the other hand, you do plan space planning, actually this is not even abstraction. It's just open condition ordering. If you remember, open condition ordering doesn't have to be backtracked over. Any open condition ordering will work. Open condition ordering in planning, in plan space planning is like variable ordering in CSP. Any variable order will work, but some are much more efficient than others in terms of finding the solution. It's the same thing for open condition ordering. Right? So by the time people figured out the connections between plan space planning and strips, they realized, hey, strips kind of an idea, which looks so nice, and there's this beautiful symmetry that there are important conditions, there are less important conditions. It's just a heuristic for open conditions. It's a variable ordering heuristic. And if you say variable ordering heuristic, nobody will take your paper. You say variable ordering abstraction, oh, abstraction, good stuff. So I'm not saying don't say things to get your paper in. I'm just saying after the paper gets in, write an extra section saying, bozos, this is the connection. Right? That's important. So that, you know, now that you went up the ladder, take the ladder up. It's a bad ladder. Okay. Sorry, what am I doing? Okay, so it turns out that this precondition ordering importance, how do you learn it? It's a good question. And first point, of course, is, as I said, you also have to realize that if you are using plan space planning, then it's just a heuristic. And you know, you could have learned better heuristics, what's heuristics, but it's not end of the world. Any open condition ordering will lead you to the plan. Furthermore, any open condition ordering will give you the optimal plan. Interesting. So most of the headache of upstrips just goes out the window. You see what I'm saying? Just by looking at it this way, it's no longer, you know, but so the question then is, how do you, if you're in the upstrips world, how would you get the precondition ordering, managed? And how do you get these numbers, which is more important, which is less important? At the time of upstrips, our Sacerdote just said, these are more important, these are less important. You agree? I agree. Fine. You just agreed with me. I said, I'll be in San Francisco with a pen. Being San Francisco is more important than having a pen. You all agreed. Yeah, I was right. So I specified which is more important. And it's sort of commonsensically correct because I know something about the domain. And so, I just take them. A reasonable question can be, can you learn this? And the thing is that there have been ideas, in particular, my friend Craig Knobloch, actually his thesis was essentially about learning the precondition ordering. It's very seductive. Basically all it does is it looks at the operator description, writes like an, kind of an operator graph, which is sort of showing which conditions are connected to which conditions, which conditions are basically connected. So a condition is downstream from another condition if in fact it becomes it has a precondition of the other thing. Okay, and so what happens then is if you have this directed graph, then you do a topological sort and then you put numbers on the topological sort. That would be ordering of things. And basically, Craig wrote a nice little thesis, and there was in 1991. I'm hoping that Craig won't hear this lecture, but in 1991 there was a plan in the AAAI. There were three papers by Craig. So people like me who were unhappy that he has so many papers, there is blocks world planning and there's no blocks world planning. Because Knobloch wrote all these papers. But anyway, so he had three papers on this stuff. It was actually very influential. People basically said, at least there's an idea. I have an operator graph and I figure out how to, use the dependencies in the operator graph to get the numbers on the preconditions. Yes, you'll get the numbers. The question is there any guarantee that it actually improves the performance? To be honest, actually, Craig was able to show in his thesis that for his, it actually works for him in the context of steps. It's the same thing RL people show right now. You come up with an idea and say, base level RL with my idea does better. Okay. And RL is so bad in pixel space that pretty much any idea will make it better. Okay. However, then basically Dave Smith, another friend of mine, essentially wrote this paper pointing out this connection. First of all, that look, this precondition ordering is nothing but open condition, in classical, in partial order planning. And it turns out that, in fact, if you look at plan-space planners, partial order planners, these abstractions actually don't necessarily do any better than other ones. In fact, there are better ideas. In particular, it's the kind of thing I was telling you. Sometimes having the pen is more important than being in San Francisco. Those are the cases where pens are in acute shortage. What is an abstraction cannot just depend on the operators because they don't take into account the problem distribution. In strips, how do you get the problem distribution? It gets in terms of the initial state and the goal state. You understand what I'm saying? If I'm giving too few hands in the initial state, then hands become all of a sudden important. And you have to figure them out first. If there is plenty of hands to lift blocks, then I can ignore the hands. So really abstraction is a property of the distribution of the problems, not just the domain theory. Okay. And so, something that learns from scratch over problem-specific problem distributions can do better. But oftentimes people just say, here's an abstraction data. That's kind of important to understand. So basically abstractions have to be specific to the distribution of the problems that the agent expects to encounter. In fact, there's sort of like database conjunctive query optimization. If you have a prologue where you're saying, you can say, how many of you remember? Apartment pet, APT pet. It's like this actually. Apartment pet X if pet X and small x. Yeah, and small x. Right? That's my rule. Something can be an apartment pet if it's a pet and it's small. I'm trying to figure out if something can be, and I'm looking for, can you find me some apartment pets? So you can go into the world and look for all the small things and ask, is it a pet? Is it a pet? Is it a pet? Or you can go into the world, get pets and say, is it small? Is it small? Is it small? Which one would you do? Whatever you do depends on your distributional assumptions about your world. In the world of Grabding-Nagians, remember Gulliver's Travels? Small is harder to find than pets. So look for the first small thing you can find and see if it's pet. Because those people are basically having dinosaurs as pets. And they can't live in your normal apartments. In our world, too damn many things are small and very few of them are pets. So you first check if something is a pet and then check if it is small, instead of checking with small and then check pet. Do you understand what I'm just saying? This is a general idea. This depends on the problem distribution. And in conjunctive query optimization, not surprisingly, there's always a history of where ideas come from. This is what Dave Smith did for his PhD. Okay, so Dave Smith essentially said, logic programs have these conjunctive preconditions and people are assuming that there are specific ways to work on which preconditions first. He said, no, it's not obvious. You actually have to take the distribution into account and compute that. And so once he's thinking that way, he could see, yeah, clearly any static abstraction would fail. Now, the point that you want to remember is static abstractions have this seductive property. You would like to believe that the abstraction is static rather than problem specific and problem distribution specific. Because most of the abstractions we tend to think of are like, generally tend to be, hey, they'll always work, kind of. But in general, that's not guaranteed. Okay. Let's see if I probably should stop here. Yeah, so this sort of punctures the static abstraction view that we tend to prize. That's basically the thing. I'm going to stop and then continue here in the second part. Take a 15-minute break. Okay, so we'll get started. As usual, I thought I even had this idea that I probably won't have time. I won't be able to fill the time. So I'll nicely ask you guys to kind of spend time talking to each other about what project groups you might make. But at this point, I can't even complete the HTML the way it's done, but that's the normal life. But anyway, you should spend time on doing your project groups, etc. And you should have questions on that on Piazza and make it's more important for you. So you have to make it more important for me too by asking questions. So one question that actually, so abstraction, by the way, I didn't say this, but atomic states to lifted states is an abstraction. You understand what I'm saying? Going from atomic states to features, state representing states over features, it's an abstraction. Okay, so again, there's so many ideas around abstraction, which is why it remains, but we are also talking about, I'm actually starting from most of the problems I'm talking about will hold irrespective of which abstractions you look at. Even if you look at atomic to lifted state, and if you think in terms of, can you do everything that you could have done in the atomic states in this lifted representation? Then all of a sudden, it's the same URP, DRP issues. Okay, so the ideas that we talk, even though we started from the strips, PDL operators and went up above that, I did mention also that the macro operators will be just skip connections, and similarly, options are actually in the atomic state space anyway, in RL. But so the idea is that atomic and lifted themselves are, one is an abstraction of the other, and secondly, where you start and do abstraction from, wherever you start and do abstraction from, many of these issues will be important. I'm just doing it with respect to strips planning because there are tons of work that's been done there. So in detailed postponement, in general, what we did in the precondition abstraction is a detailed postponement. The less important preconditions were pushed to work on later, and more important preconditions were done beforehand. So if you think of it as detailed postponement, then least commitment is connected to abstraction. Not committing to anything that you need to retract later is an abstraction. So the funny thing that was happening for upstrips is, on one hand, it is trying to not commit to the importance of the conditions by working on the more important conditions first and less important conditions later, but it was committing to the position of the operators. Whereas by the time you come to plan space planning, you don't actually commit to any ordering either. So in fact, these things will wind up. So on one hand, plan space planners already are less committed in terms of positioning, and so some other ideas about abstraction may not be as useful for them, right? Because they're already better in that level of assertion. So in general, postpone commitments until forced. This is basically kind of plan space planning, and that you can think of that also as related to abstraction. Why is this not working? Yeah. And this was what that in 2000, actually, one of my students did this thing called real plan with Biplab Srivastava. And what he did is exactly this idea that if you take something like a Bloxworld planner, right, and increase the number of hands, just increase the number of hands. Okay, you would think that the problem has become easier in a normal sense. You have more hands to pick stuff with. But a strict planner, a PTL planner actually dies because there are more hands. It's a paradoxical thing. This is basically a paradox of choice. And it's like the paradox of choice in a very interesting way. What happens really is a failure that happened with one hand will be rediscovered with every other hand. Because the system doesn't realize that the hand has nothing to do with that failure. Like for example, you want to have sub goals A on B and B on A. You try to make A on B and then you put B on A using hand 1. Didn't work. So maybe hand 2, that might work. So you try hand 2, that doesn't work, hand 3. And maybe I should do the first one with hand 1, second one with hand 3, maybe it will work. Do you understand what I'm saying? So you would basically take one failing node and explode it into humongous number of failing nodes. And so search becomes very tight. In such cases, actually ignoring in some sense, actually, I would argue that that is the reason why we at San Francisco have a pen, for example, would also be, it's inefficient to actually do the pen thing first. Because maybe the pen might fall off. You see what I'm saying? And so basically, it's easier to look at these easily solvable goals much later. And then do the important ones first. Okay, so if you were to do this, then one of the things would be that if you assume that there are enough hands and just abstract the hands out and say that basically pick with hand H, where H, the actual identity of the hand is not given during the planning step. So you make a plan assuming, so I will get this done, I will go to San Francisco and I won't say which flight, for example. Or which pilot, for example. Pilot is important for the plane, but I don't say it at all. Okay, and then in the next level, in the scheduling level, I'll actually just assign the hands. And you can show that, basically you can get huge improvements, performance improvements, because you are essentially avoiding repeating failures. Okay, trash by addressing, planning, and scheduling considered together by regenerating same failure many times in irrelevant disguises. And so when you abstract it away, then essentially it becomes less important, and then so you just do it afterwards, and you can improve the performance quite significantly. Which is sort of the reason why planning and scheduling is separated. You can actually argue that task planning and motion planning are at some level similar. You're doing task planning at the high level, and then you're doing the actual motions required at the lower level. Now, in general, for most of these abstractions, there will be some kinds of loose coupling. Sometimes it actually matters to understand what's going to happen at the scheduling level. If you don't, people will make fun of you. So the real question is, when do you use the abstraction? When do you come out of the direction that abstraction has cornered you into? This is work that's still continuing, actually. In fact, much of task and motion planning integration essentially involves figuring out, when do you actually go back to task planning, and and when do you not have to just be able to take the task plan, and also when you're making the task plan, when should you be aware of the motion constraints during the task plan so that you're more likely to come up with a plan that actually will have a motion. Otherwise, you just go back and forth and back and forth. Those are the issues that basically become important in the task and motion planning integration, for example. And here I just call it in terms of planning and scheduling integration. And in fact, this also gets connected to what are called planning modulo theories. The idea is you do planning and then you're calling these additional specialized reasoners that do scheduling, that do motion constraints, etc., etc. And you're trying to figure out when to call these critiques. The simplest idea is just do your plan and then get it critiqued. The better idea is somehow make sure, that the critics will be happy while you are generating without spending way too much time. And then when you're done, you will have fewer interactions to go back and forth between motion plan and task plan. Okay, so this was essentially kind of a now, in general, there is backtracking across abstraction levels. In general, that's not surprising at all. Abstract, the picture that people paint about abstraction is you do it at the abstract level, then it becomes concrete and you're happy. It never works most of the time. You will have to kind of try, and if it doesn't work at concrete level, you go back up to the abstraction. So not only do you have such backtracking between plans at one level, it also is backtracking across levels. You guys understand? And if you want to get a better sense of it, in trying to find a task plan, there may be search across multiple task plans. In trying to find a motion plan, there is search across different potential motion plans. In addition to that, you also have search between motion and task plan. Because this motion plan didn't work for the task, so that task plan is actually not feasible, go back. So, and very important thing is knowing when to check if abstraction holds is critical. And that again makes people unhappy because you think that abstraction should just work. I should have to check whether the abstraction holds or not. Okay. Okay, that's about detail abstraction. Okay. Then I will talk about temporal abstraction. In fact, I forget, I should check, but which came first in strips? Macro operators are temporal abstraction. Okay. So the idea of temporal abstraction is take big steps instead of single actions. So it's like skip steps in the graph or options in the MDP. Okay. So what are the big steps? In strip style planning, chunks of contiguous sequences of operators. You put all of them together, take this whole chunk and then try to figure out what are the generalized preconditions, generalized effects of this. So in fact, every time you find a plan, okay, I don't have this. Okay. Every time you find a plan, let's say, for some problem, okay, that problem basically that was solving is I and G. I can say this cement block solves when I is true, it will give me G. But does it require everything in I? If I actually do causal analysis of the correctness of this plan, you will know which parts of the I wound up getting used by the plan. The others, if they were not there, the plan would still have worked. So all of a sudden you generalized. Not only do you actually say, the simplest thing is this plan works whenever you have this I and this G. Okay, and so you can think of this as an operator. It's called a macro operator, which has its precondition I affects G. But the reality is, it can have, the reality is that M of will have I dash as the preconditions, where I dash is a subset of I. That means not everything in the initial state is actually needed for this plan. And it has G dash as the fx, where G dash is a superset of G. Because you cared about some goals for this macro operator, but it actually gives more effects than what you are using. I mean, you built refrigerator to cool food, but then now that the refrigerator is there, you can also use the fact that it heats the room. You understand what I'm saying? So if you do that, then you actually made a macro operator. You can store it along with your other operators. So in particular, what I just did here is generalization of the plan. I generalize the plan to see which parts of the initial state are really required, what more does it give as effects. And I generalize this using causal explanation of correctness. Right? Because that's the simplest way to figure out why this. So basically, every step of this place, every one of these guys have preconditions. Maybe it has preconditions P1 and P2. P2 is given by this, P1 is coming from the initial state. So when I look at the entire macro operator, I can see which preconditions have to be externally supplied, which effects will continue to hold after the last action of the macro operator. So if I'm using it as a cement block, then those are the effects of the operator. These are the preconditions of the operator. I generalize the heck out of the plan. I'm not just storing the plan, I'm generalizing and storing the plan. And I'm generalizing it using the causal structure. So this would be considered explanation-based generalization. Explanation-based generalization. And that will give you the macro operator. Now you have these macro operators, you can use it along with other operators, and you can make big jumps. Okay. Now the interesting thing is that essentially the way you're doing the structure is anyway with causal structure. Once you do it in the causal structure, you might as well realize that there is no reason to say the plan would be like a cement brick. I can actually consider the causal structure and make public how the internal causal structure of the plan is to some extent, so that new things can be added in the middle of the plan. If you do that, your plan reusing instead of just using it as a macro operator. You see what I'm saying? Now, reused plan is usable more often than just as a macro operator. But then reused plan might very well look nothing at all like the one that you store, because it's like basically, give me a normal coffee and then you give enough constraints that it's no longer a normal coffee. Okay. So in the MDP equivalent, MDP is the equivalent of the macro operators or options, as I mentioned. Option can be thought of as a mini MDP in a small part of the state space, where some states are, if you think in terms of goal-based MDPs, then some states are terminal states, those are the goal states. Some states are entry states. And then in essence, there is a policy for going from the initial states to the terminal states, internally. And you construct it in storytelling. And next time around, you can use it almost as an action. You can actually compute its transition function. The one difference is that the internal, this particular MDP, essentially the sub MDP, makes the original MDP non-MDP. This is not confusing enough, because it's no longer barcode, because it's essentially dependent on multiple states, doing a multiple states. Okay, so you would call them semi-MDPs. So the biggest thing I want you to think of is, in general, if there's one thing that I want you to remember from this class, determinism is a good thing, in the sense that it's not that the world is deterministic. If an idea you have doesn't make sense at all in the deterministic case, it's rarely a good idea. You understand what I'm saying? So you can come up with a very complex idea and consider its projection into deterministic planning and see if it makes sense there. If it doesn't make sense there, it doesn't make sense in the general case either. You see what I'm saying? You're just hoping that the complexity of the problem pushes your limitations under the rug. So that's what I want you to think about. So whenever you see options in RL, think macro ops and see whether what they're doing would make sense if you reduce it to a deterministic MDP. If you have a deterministic MDP, you have macro ops. If it doesn't make sense there, then probably it doesn't make much of sense. Okay, so that's a worthwhile thing. It's like a sanity check that you may want to do. And as I said, oh, by the way, if you're using options, you're skipping over state, and so MDP is no longer Markov, so it becomes semi-Markov. By the way, so can also be partial plans with causal structure. This will lead you to plan reuse. That turns out to be my PhD thesis, actually. So the macro operators and options, the non-glitzy theory is the following, that to get the macro operators after every planning episode, you can pick chunks of the plan you just made and memorize them for later use. Okay. In fact, you can also generalize them. You can also generalize basically EBG, exponential based generalization, and store. So that whenever you have this I dash and they need to get the G dash, you can use this macro operator. Okay. Given the chunk, you can basically analyze the causal structure to see which preconditions are not internally supported, which effects are surviving beyond the last operator. So that will tell you I dash and G dash. And this is basically exponential based generalization step. So the former are preconditions of the macro, the later are the effects, and you now have a new macro operator. It's like a black box. Inside this thing happens, right? Now, will macro operators affect the completeness and optimality of the planner? By now, you should know the answer. Of course, it does. If you only use macro operators. So if you have a graph and you put skip connections and remove the normal connections, then there are paths that were there in the graph that you can't find with just the skip connections. You see what I'm saying? Right? And the same thing happened in the Flagstaff scenario. You had a graph of going from any point on the earth between Phoenix and Flagstaff to any other point. That was the full graph. And the highway thing is like skip connections. It will take some states very fast to some other states. But if you only have highway state and remove the rest of the graph, then there are certain paths that were possible before that you will never find. It should not be surprising. Did you understand what I'm saying? It should not be surprising. So, yes, it will affect the completeness and optimality of the planner. I mean, highway plans are optimal for a different thing. It's not optimal for the distance. It should be known. Okay. It's actually optimal not even for the time necessarily. It's optimal for safety, time, blah, blah, blah. The kind of objectives that people should have according to Google. Let's face it, because we just take whatever Google tells us to take. Right? And so essentially, in that particular case, so it's not optimal for the original baseline planner's optimality metric. And if you only use macro operators, but if you use them in addition to the normal operators, then of course, like if you have a graph and you put skip connections also, then every path was there. Plus there are some skip connection paths also. But the problem then is the graph has high branching factor, higher branching factor. It has strictly higher branching factor than the original graph. Because of which you have to decide, should I take the macro operator or the normal operator? Yeah.
Quick question. So is there ever going to be a case where a macro operator captures like a pattern sufficiently that we can actually get rid of primitive actions? Like obviously in the general case,
again, it depends very much. It depends very much on the problems that I will ever be allowed to ask. You understand what I'm saying? The answer, remember, it's all about problem distribution. If you stop me from, so the way you make highway optimality the only optimality you ever wanted is you'll never allow me to specify a goal state that is not on highways. Then if you just artificially hold me so that I can't put like a point on top of some mesa in the middle of, Bumblebee and some other place, then I say, look, I allowed you to specify the problem, and then I can solve the problem. And I stop you from specifying any other problem that you might want.
What about, say, ordering our search so that we consider macro operators before primitive operators, for instance? So
That's what people try, but those are all heuristics. I mean, the thing to understand is there's nothing big here. These are essentially statistical properties of the distribution of the problems. If you agree with it, then you could basically avoid the mistakes that people made, the paradoxes that people went through in planning for the longest time, and in RL they're still going through. That's what that means. Okay. So you can get optimality either by redefining it, like saying hierarchical optimality. It's like, why not say raw optimality? I give you raw optimality. You don't like raw optimality. I mean, why do you like hierarchical optimality? I just made up a new notion of optimality. Either you can do that or artificially are sticking to a possibly artificial problem set. For this problem set, this works. So what do you get? So for example, here, as I said, don't let the user specify goals on top of some off-road thing. If they can't specify, then you can't not submit. Okay. And then the next question is, which sequences should you convert and keep as macro operators? Like I said, every time you make a plan, you can take a sequence and make it as a plan. Now, it's interesting. Sometimes, if I have like a big plan, I have a big plan, and suppose it turns out that actually it is doing two independent sub-goals, each of which can have multiple steps. It makes sense to cut it into two pieces and remember the two pieces. Do you understand that? Suppose I have a plan for getting gas and buying cauliflower. Okay, and they're more or less, let's say, they're independent. And then so you just separate the cauliflower plan from the tease them apart from the gas plan, and then store both of them as separate macro operators. Oh, by the way, one other name that I should tell you. One other name I should tell you. Is the word scales. It's fashionable to say scales. It's like that Napoleon dynamite. What is it? Girls like boys with skills. So people in RL like planners with skills. Okay, skills are nothing but macro operators and options. Okay, surprisingly enough, actually, Satinder Singh has a paper. Satinder Singh actually one time gave Satinder Singh is a very nice RL guy. Basically gave a talk saying, don't learn actions, learn skills. Right. Okay, interestingly, this actually, one thing that you have to understand is we are starting from a complete action space in terms of strips, and you are on top of it looking at macro operators which are like bundled skills. In complete open worlds, there is no such thing as complete action space to begin with. And so you may well be only looking at a behavior trace that you're able to get and say, okay, that is a skill that I know again. So there is that distinction when you don't have a originally complete space. But much of RL really does depend on simulators, which means it has a complete space. And so the macros are essentially all these things that I'm talking about for streams planning make sense for simulator-based RL. Okay. I should write this down somewhere like this. Yeah. Okay. What there was a question?
Yeah. Could you explain what you mean by skills again?
Well, skill basically is just another name for macro operators and options. Okay. They're not there. Basically, for any given domain model, there is something called a primitive action. There is no such thing as a really primitive action. Everything, even a primitive action can be made to even more primitive actions. But for any given domain model, there are something called primitive actions that you are taking as the actions that you can ask the robot to do. And then there are bundled actions. And you are asking the robot to do those bundled actions. That's like a skill. Like, instead the robot knows how to turn left, right, and then basically up and down on a grid, right? Let's say, and then it might have a skill of going in straight line. You see what I'm saying? So it's a nice idea, but it's just, if you think about skills as essentially macro operators and options, then that's a good way of understanding what people are talking about. Yeah, okay. So this is me using options in my MS thesis in 1986. I just didn't call them options, unfortunately. This was essentially doing, in a free space, I want to find a path from one point to other. And the free space has obstacles, the kind of thing that I was telling you earlier. Now I can do search at the level of pixels and say some pixels are impossible, some pixels are passable. Imagine that the robot is actually a point robot, so it can go through any point. And if you think that the robot has this shape, robotics people have figured out this idea called configuration space, which involves shrinking the robot to a point and expanding the obstacles. Okay, if in fact the robot has multiple degrees of freedom, when you shrink the robot to a point, you also change the dimensionality of the space. You understand what I'm saying? It's no longer like a 2D or a 3D, it can be ND if there are like N joints that are independently controllable. And so the good thing is after you do configuration space trick, then finding a path is just finding a point path in this high dimensional space. Okay, so the interesting question would be, would you still do point-based, connect points to points that go from one point to other? Or do you want to say this whole area is a free space? I just consider that whole thing as a block. If you do the later, certainly you can do things faster. Okay, so there was this idea called in quad trees. And what do quad trees do? They are essentially very positional dependent abstraction, spatial abstraction, where if you have like a white space, so if you have like a white space where only this part is an obstacle, let's say only one quadrant is an obstacle, right? Then you can say basically there are 4 quadrants, one is an obstacle, the other 3 are free. If it's irregular shaped obstacle, you will basically split the free space into multiple regularly shaped squares. So there will be a lot more of this, this is a static abstraction. Quadrants are basically static abstraction. They're also not a great abstraction, they're position dependent because the same obstacle, if it is here, I can represent it with 4 nodes, 3 of which are free and 1 is obstacle. If I shift this a little to the center, all of a sudden, it's not in any single quadrant, and so everything is gray. Okay, so what I did as an MS thesis student who had to find something to do is basically said, okay, so if you have, I'll do the quadtree thing, and I'll basically try to search in the space of the certain level of abstraction quadtree. And then basically I can wind up putting the big nodes the big free space nodes as part of the thing. And then when I need to make the plan, I'll just be able to find some path through that free space. The next question would be, well, it is possible based on the space placement of the obstacle. There may not be any big free space nodes because the free space got fragmented because you push the obstacle into the middle or something. So you'll wind up having these gray nodes. The gray nodes you can talk about the percentage of the grayness. So if you have like if you shift this a little this side, just a little this side, then this is no longer a free node. It's 99% free, 1% black, 1% obstacle. So it becomes a gray node. But I can say it's very high enough gray. I'll ignore the grayness and act as if it's free and put it as part of my plan. And when I then need to find the path, at that point, I'll find the path inside the free space, in the gray node. You understand? It's not a particularly great, hard thing to do, but it's one of my most cited papers. It's called multi-resolution path planning. I should always come up with a good name. Multi-resolution path planning. Evergreen name. People are still citing it. Okay. So, but the point is, I'm essentially doing options, deterministic options. Okay. And it's kind of quadtree is a kind of an abstraction. If you don't believe me, that's how I used to look in 1986. Okay. So, was there a question? Okay. Temporal abstraction, basically, there is macro operators. I said there's a reuse, and there's one other thing actually called replay, which is a very interesting distinction, which is, are you reusing the actions, the ground level actions, or are you reusing the problem solver's decisions that led to it picking these ground level actions? You understand what I'm saying? So, if I made a pancake, I don't know why I'm thinking about a pancake, I can reuse the pancake. I can reuse piece of a pancake. But I can also remember the actions I did to produce a pancake. In this case, pancake is the plan. Okay. You can think of the actions that I did to produce the pancake and replay them in a slightly different context. You understand what I'm saying? So that would be called derivational replay. There are like different ways of doing analogy. One is just using the structure. The other is replaying the decisions that made that structure. And there are interesting technical differences, but that's yet another way of reusing things. I'm actually not completely sure whether RL folks do this, but certainly planning folks did that. Okay. So there's reuse, replay, and macro operators. And the structures being reused, the question is, are they black boxes? That means you use the whole structure, or you are allowed to change things. So whenever you go to a restaurant where they say no substitutions, have you seen that? Have you been to restaurants other than McDonald's? And they say no substitutions. That means you don't get to say, can you make me this very Michelin 3-star thing, except I need less salt, more rose petals, and extra pieces of cauliflower. They'll say, go to the McDonald's out there, and then they'll tell you what they have. So when they say no substitutions, they're saying black box. Because they figured out how to make one thing, and then they're going to make that for you, and you're not going to ask for changing, customizing it. You see what I'm saying? So this is opaque versus modifiable. Are you allowed to modify the structure being reused? Okay. Solution, are you reusing the solution? Or are you reusing the solving process itself? That's the replay versus reuse difference. And then acquisition of the structures to be reused. Are the humans giving it? Are you learning them from scratch? And the mechanics of reuse, probably we won't talk about this. There are all sorts of costs involved in actually reusing, which is including the storage costs. If you have to remember macro operators, you have to remember them in addition to the operators. And then more important than the storage cost is using them during the planning. That increases the branching factor at every decision step. Branching factor increase can be pretty daunting. Okay, and these are all the things that become important in the temporal abstraction. These all basically make sense for options too. If you build up a lot more options, then how are you going to make sure that it's actually more efficient? Nobody talks about efficiency, in RL with options. It's just that, look, I have skips, I have big, skips and so on. Okay, so I did my PhD thesis for some strange reason. I don't know, this one class had both my MS thesis and my PhD thesis. My PhD thesis actually I did plan reuse, where I take the entire plan, and in fact, I wound up using the hierarchically task network plan. Because why? That was the only plans we used to use. It was like the strangest thing. As I told you, Nova, in one fell swoop, went from mean sense analysis planning to hierarchical task network plan space planning with a whole bunch of holes. Right? Okay. And basically, so I actually remember, in fact, I'll send you, if somebody reminds me, I'll send you a funny story. I may have sent it to you. I don't think I sent it to you, but about how when I was doing the thesis, I said, hey, I'll just get the Nova plan. And then I'll start rebuilding on top of it. And then I sent a mail to Earl Sacerdote, then he essentially, hey, what part of soup code don't you understand? It doesn't exist. I can't give it to you. And then somebody else actually tried to do plan space planning as what's called tweak. David Chapman, who's actually very busy on Twitter these days. Interestingly, I found him after like 30 years or something, and he's alive and well on Twitter. He made tons of money on stock market, I think, but he did a kind of a version of formalization of just the atomic action plan space planning called tweak. Then I said, hey, David, send me the thing. He said, no, I proved its complexity properties. I don't have that planner either. And so then I had to go back to something called non-lin, which was Austin Tate did this. And then I used that planner and then did my reuse work on top of it. And non-lin actually is a very nice character as my planner. If somebody reminds me, I will send you a nice note I wrote one time on planning list about how nice non-lin is, and it wasn't well appreciated at its time. But anyway, so I was doing reuse of the plan. I remember the plan, I stored the plan, and then when I have to solve a new problem, I try to see which parts of the structure of the plan can be used, both at the abstract level or at the concrete level. And then, when you have to extend it, then you are essentially starting from a partial plan and adding more actions, and the plan space sets. One interesting thing is when you're doing reuse, it's no longer refinement planner. Because you take a big plan and throw away the stuff that's no longer needed in the new problem. When you remove constraints, it's not refinement. And then you have a partial plan and you extend it. So that's plan reuse, and there's a list machine, by the way. This is list machine. Okay, and I kind of implemented that on this machine, blah, blah, blah. And then, another student of mine did some of this stuff for replay, derivation of replay. I'm not going to go through that, but, essentially reuse versus replay, the distinction is, are you, reusing the pancake or reusing the pancake making process? Okay. One interesting thing, so we are going to get to the task network planning, at least 15 minutes are there. But one interesting thing I want to mention to you, which is kind of probably surprising to you, is if you do plan reuse, would plan reuse be more efficient than planning or not? Reusing plans, is it more efficient than planning from scratch or not?
How much you have to undo the plan?
Not only that, that's a very good point. I mean, my favorite example of plan reuse is the mathematicians putting off the fire in the room. Did I tell this to you? Okay, so one day a mathematician wakes up. Basically he was smoking, and then they left the cigarette there, and then the room got on fire. They wake up, they see the place is full of smoke. They need some water to throw on the small fire that was raging. So, but the glass that they put is empty, so they go into the bathroom, fill the glass full of water, come and pour it on the fire, go to sleep. 15 days later, since people don't change, this thing again happens. Except this time they wake up and they find that the initial state has changed. The glass is full of water. So what do? They throw the water on the floor. So now it's reduced and already solved problem and go back to sleep. Mathematicians do this, right? I don't want to have to prove it again, right? It's like I proved it once, it's reduced to already, and that mathematician doesn't exist anymore, obviously. But the point is, that's a classic case of reusing to say I reused it. I just essentially undo some part of the initial state such that I can still say I can reuse the whole time. But a more interesting question is, if I said here is the initial state, and here is the goal state, find optimal plan, find optimal plan. That's the normal planning problem. The plan reuse problem is, here is the initial state, here is the goal state, and if I say here is a plan pi, maximally reuse pi and solve I to G. So the question is it option or is it imperative? Reuse is an option, or no? When I say reuse is an option, you'll say, oh, I don't want to reuse, throw it out and I just do my own thing. But sometimes reuse can be an imperative, because I want you to stick to well-known plans that people have done before. Especially the plan that I have done before, I want you to stick close to it so that I can make sense of the plan you are doing. In which case, it's not just to solve the original problem I to G, it is solving the original problem I to G such that it is close to pi. What does this problem remind you guys of? Something very, very close. Yes, I'm impressed, but that's close. But something even closer. Explicable plans. Making an explicable plan is not just going from I to G. A robot can have its own happy life just going from I to G. Now you're saying not only should you go from I to G, but your plan should be close to the best plan I would have made in my new model M dash. So then I need to actually find a plan for I to G that works in my model, but that's closer to your plan, which is a general version of this problem of plan reuse. And so it actually, in the worst case, plan reuse may not be actually easier than planning. In fact, it can be worse than planning in worst case complexity. In fact, there are some special cases, some pathological special cases where planning itself is polynomial instead of being piece-space complete in that special case. But plan reuse can be NP-1. That sort of tells you that you should use reuse, you should reuse the plan, could be a blessing or a curse. If it's an option, it's a blessing. If it's a requirement, it's a curse. Okay, and the same thing for abstractions. Basically, if you allow to not use the abstractions, then you can't do worse than what you were doing before. If you're required to use abstractions, you may actually get worse in terms of certain properties. In this particular case, even just the cost of finding them. Was there a question? Yes, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so with the whole mathematicians putting a fire out type of example, if we took the plan of putting the fire out as having the preconditions that the glass is empty, there's a fire, and the actions are fill up the cup, put out the fire, is there a way to encode that plan as having the precondition be not required for the entire plan as a whole, because the only reason that you have the you fill up the cup is because
so for that to do, it's a very interesting question. So the question that, what's your name?
I'm Tom.
Tom Blunt.
Tom, yeah.
Tommy, okay, I still don't know who you are, even though you send me big pictures. So, I wish when people talk, name comes up. Name is first of all a nonsensical thing. I hope you understand, including my name, because when you start forgetting things, the first things you forget are the names, because name has nothing to do with the thing. I know lots and lots of stuff about all of you as to whether you're paying attention, whether you ask interesting questions, and if you ask who are you, I have no idea. Because it's much harder to do. But so the thing that Tom is saying is an interesting question, which is I may have a plan and I'm storing it, and I found that preconditions I found of effects. Instead of storing the entire plan, can I realize, for example, that having an empty glass is not required? If it is an empty glass, there is a sub-plan that will fill it. That is kind of connected to separating out. So, for example, instead of this full plan being remembered, you can scuttle it into two pieces. You can say filling the glass sub-plan that I store it separately, and put in the fire-off plan that I store separately. In which case you do. Okay, but then that's extra work in trying to figure out. It's so much simpler to just throw the whole thing in. Okay. Yeah, so let's just at least try to get 15 minutes or so the task HTM planning, and then obviously we'll talk more about it a little bit more again next class. So in HTM planning, it gives you everything you want. Okay, so it actually is close to what you think of as abstraction. Okay, in real world, which is I have a task to do. Doing that task requires me to do these subtasks in some arbitrary partial order. Doing those subtasks might require me to do some other subtasks. So the abstract task can be reduced into more concrete task networks. You can call them policies, you can call them plans, but they're called task networks. And the task network is again further reduced up until the point where every task in the plan is essentially what is called a primitive task. That means that's an action that the robot is ready to do. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's HTM plan. And you can find multiple, and in fact, one of the most interesting things is, so for example, it's like this. So I want to go travel from source to destination. That's a task, abstract task. I can do that by the go by bus method or go by train method. And if I do the go by bus method, it requires the following partial plan. Get into the bus, buy the ticket, get out of the bus. In most buses, typically, at least in my world, I guess in most buses, you buy the ticket inside the bus. Okay. In the go to train, buy the ticket, then get in the train, otherwise you'll get a hefty fine. Okay, and then get out at the destination. So this is like the simplest, hierarchy of the tasks. Now, of course, and then basically, I also have this thing called hitchhike from source to destination. Okay, that's an extra action. Now, the interesting thing is that the expectation is the good plans correspond to something that you started at the abstract level and made it concretized. So hitchhiking, according to this theory, is not a good plan. It's a MacGyver plan. And MacGyver plans make for good TV. They're not good plans. If you do that, your boss will be pretty unhappy because every time you're doing something crazy different stuff. And you need regularity in life. Okay. So the interesting question then is, so this is basically this hierarchical network, this sort of a reduction, these are called methods, are also called reduction schemas. So the reduction schema, go by train tells you, so go by train is a method for traveling and its reduction schema is this. You see what I'm saying? And to say what this is doing, you can think of it in two different ways. One is you're trying to solve the problem by first solving at the top level and then solving it next level. That looks like it's an abstraction. Another way of saying it is that why isn't hitchhiking a good plan? Because hitchhiking is not a grammatically correct plan. where the grammar is this. Have you guys seen the parse trees in life? Parse trees of your sentences, parts of speech labeling in sentences. They look like this, hierarchical trees. Whether or not an English sentence is grammatically correct is based on whether you can construct a parse tree for it. If you can't construct a parse tree, then it's not grammatically correct. It may be a sentence. People may understand what you're saying, but it's not grammatically correct. So, meaningful sentence and grammatically correct sentence are two orthogonal things in English. Meaningful plan and grammatically correct, hierarchically correct plan are two orthogonal things in planning. Just as I can have, I make a sentence which is sort of, especially, missing an article or probably using the wrong verb and subject agreement. And then I ask this question, oh my God, and I said this wrong sentence. They say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm not going to understand what you're saying. That's not grammatic. Then I'll say, it's good. Basically, you're not an intelligent person. You basically are ignoring the fact that the sentence has meaning and just throwing it out because it's not grammatically correct. On the other hand, I can have colorless green ideas sleeping furiously. How many of you have heard of this? What have you heard in life? What did you do? You just came into this class? So anyway, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Perfectly grammatically correct sentence which makes no damn sense. What do you mean colorless and green? And why are ideas sleeping furiously? Do you understand what I'm saying? Who do you know? Which poet do you know who writes stuff like this in English? What? E-comics? No, e-comics just doesn't know how to last cap locks. Shift key, that's it. So
This isn't a poet, but Douglas Adams sometimes looked right.
yeah, but I mean, come on, there's civilization before all of this. Lewis Carroll, Alice in the Wonderland. It has poems. And it's, the chub and the bosom. So when I was a grad student in Maryland, all our machines, first of all, machines used to be so few that they'll have names. Nowadays, it's like having a name for a machine is like having a machine name for your cell phone, So yeah, what can I say? so basically, we'd have like whimsy, toe, jub. These are all the machines. Read that poem. It is nice to read. It has no meaning whatsoever. You understand what I'm saying? So hierarchy essentially can be thought of as a grammar, and you can have hierarchically correct plans which don't execute because they're not meaningful. Executability is meaning. Hierarchy is a preference. Grammar is some nonsensical thing that you English-speaking people made up, and similarly, we Telugu people made our own grammar. But it's like, if you understand what I mean, why do you care whether it's grammatical? But we do, right? We make fun of people, and if they write ungrammatical sentences, sorry, you obviously do IQ person, we are not going to hire. But if on the other hand, they have colorless green ideas sleeping furiously, yes, you have 3 jobs. Because, it looks like one funny, interesting thing is kids get perplexed if you tell them ungrammatical sentences. Eventually, once they figure out grammar themselves, originally they don't know how to speak grammatical sentences. They talk meaningful but ungrammatical sentences. But once they kind of figure it out, then if you say ungrammatical sentence, they get perplexed. If on the other hand, you tell them jub and whimsy and green ideas sleeping furiously, they find it funny. Because they understand that it is grammatical, but it doesn't make sense. So an interesting question, remember long back I mentioned that LLMs can't plan. right? LLMs can't plan. LLMs can write sentences. LLMs almost never write ungrammatical sentences. I know most grad students in this program are worse than LLMs, right? Because you all, including those of you who actually learned English as mother tongue, can write ungrammatical sentences. LLMs will never do it. How do you take that fact and make sense with Karthik's results that LLMs also make plans that are mostly incorrect? Because in essence, finding a reasonable sentence that's grammatically correct is like being hierarchically parsable. That doesn't necessarily mean that it has meaning. In fact, even now, the best of LLM essays will be garden path essays. And you like it because everything is grammatical, so it must be making sense. It's just I didn't understand. That's what I'm saying. Okay, and so it's an interesting connection that basically you have hierarchy, and the hierarchy can be thought of as an abstraction, but it can also be thought of as a basically a grammar of good sentences, good solutions. And so who specified this grammar? Again, in normal planning literature, HTM's task reduction schemas were specified by humans. Along with the PDDL, which are the preconditions and effects, they also specified these standardized reduction schemas. And so then the planner will use these reduction schemas and try to solve the original. And so in the most interesting, the most general hierarchical planning, which is actually the one that NOVA did, as I said, because it did plan space hierarchical task network planning. So a go by bus becomes a partially ordered causal link plan fragment. It's actually a plan with, causal links. Some causal links are not supported inside the plan, some are supported inside the plan. And there is enough structure. So the reduction schema specification basically specifies this structure. So much so that you can either use it as like an entire black box, put the condition it needs in the front and the condition it's giving, take it out and use it. Or you can also go change the inside because you have all the information. That's HTL planning, essentially. Okay, there's a whole, so a reduction schema is valid. I'll take another 5 minutes so that we'll get to a reasonable place and you can leave. So a reduction schema is valid for reducing a task T as long as for every effect of the task T, there is some task T dash within the reduction that gives the effect that T is giving. So if I have an abstract task, somebody is actually giving that task effect. And similarly, for every causal link, precedence constraint, every causal link, there is a task T dash. So if there is a causal link or a precedence constraint, those are protected in the reduction scheme. So if this task is supposed to give something, if your father, think of this guy as your dad or your mom, and they made IOUs, right? And so when they get reduced into this children task, they inherit their debts, they also inherit their assets. The assets are the preconditions, debts are the effects they're supposed to give to others. So as far as the rest of the plan is concerned, whatever it was taking in and giving out would have to be shifted into the task reduction scheme. And so they get redirected, the causal links get redirected into the new children task. And then you continue doing this. Every one of these tasks can have reductions further. And when all the tasks that you have the property that they are primitive, that means some special set of tasks. So for example, if you build tasks on top of the PDDL model, then all the original PDDL actions are primitive. Everything else is a non-primitive task and it gets reduced to primitive tasks. If you do that, then essentially when everything is primitive, then you have a valid plan. And if everything is primitive and it has, it's correct by planning constraints, that means no causal link is violated, all the preconditions are supported and all that stuff. There's a causal proof, then you are done. The last question I have for today is if you were to do hierarchical task network planning, starting from the high level tasks, and then reducing them until they become primitive. Will you find optimal plans for the base level planner? That means you can do it this way, or you can just use the PDL domain theory. Will you always find the base optimal plans? Will you even get completeness? And I hope by now you realize that neither optimality nor completeness are guaranteed. And what you get is hierarchical optimality, hierarchical completeness. So if you then want completeness, then you say, fine, in addition to using tasks, you can also use primitive tasks. But then if you do that, then you're not using abstraction at all. So then essentially you will allow for hitchhiking 15 meters, taking a bus for 10 meters, then rolling down the floor for 15 meters as a good plan to go to Flagstaff. It is a valid plan. It's not a good plan because people don't like that kind of plans. And they told you what their preferences are by giving this grammar. So if I ask this question, instead of starting from the high level task to primitive tasks, if I said, think of hierarchical task networks as a grammar, then I said, will every meaningful sentence be grammatically correct? Every meaningful sentence that makes sense to people, will that be grammatically correct? The answer is no. There are more meaningful sentences than grammatically correct sentences. You see what I'm saying? And so there is like a dual view of hierarchical planning. I'll get to this again when I come back next time, that you can think of HTN planning as actually an abstraction, in which case it looks as if it's doing top-down abstraction. Or you can do it as like the parsing, a grammar. It turns out that theoretically, the parsing view is much cleaner. But the abstraction view gets you a lot more likes. Because people like abstraction. Okay, and in particular, actually, I'll come back and tell you that all sorts of crazy things, such as when you put an abstract task, you don't know all the effects that its eventual children might have. So if in plan space planning, you have this thing called simple establishment. If you're trying to get a precondition, either you take an existing step and put a link from it, or you put a new step in. If I have an abstract task, which currently doesn't give the condition P I want, but one of its eventual children can give it. And if I don't take that into consideration, I'll lose completeness. So there, basically, you have these nonsensical things like every abstract task can be a phantom contributor until proven otherwise. Because depending on the way you get reduced, you might have the effect I want. And so then you put these phantom links and wait for magic to happen. If you don't do this, you lose completeness. And another thing is that if you have a plan which actually has, this particular slide says, if you have a plan which has causal links that have conflicts such that you can't resolve the conflicts like at all, the one on the left-hand side has unresolvable conflicts. But in the context of abstract tasks, you would like to say, I will kill that plan because it has unresolvable conflicts. But the problem is when you expand A to A1, A2 and B to B1, B2, then the conflicts might get spread over points in time. So they're not conflicts anymore. You understand what I'm saying? I can't be in two places, but I'm being reduced to two people. They can be in two places. All of this make planning with these tasks a headache. But people would like to do planning that way as because it looks like abstraction. There is an idea called hierarchical reinforcement learning, which is basically close to this. And it essentially inherits all these problems, but they don't necessarily talk about it. But they do talk about hierarchical optimality and recursive optimality. I'll stop here. When we come back next class, you will read that HRL, distill order, not distill, not the gradient pub paper. And then I'll also do more of this, and then you will tell me the connections between what you read and what not. Thank you.
So options are like is there basically an option is on where you have a policy. Like you basically make some transition. Like that's what I was option.
Or like some way to do things, but
It
it would like
makes,
an
if you use an option.
or some middle.
It makes sure there's more.
Yeah.
No.
Conventional states, which you're kind of putting it as a single thing.
Yeah, I guess.
Have we get around?
I'm not totally sure about that.
So I think that Minecraft can have multiple applications in it. And options like
Yeah.
No, an option. It's the same thing.
I'm living by it legally though.
You get my.
what Minecraft, what the planning movement is options for the.
I was gonna head back.
We could just buy them.